One of my favourite things about reading is when books really make you think about the world in a whole new way. And I love that experience of finishing a book, putting it down, and then not being able to stop thinking about it. And so, welcome back to Book Break. I am here with a big pile of book recommendations for you today, and these are all really thought-provoking books. And I'm going to go through these in no particular order because just as I was picking them all up to take the thumbnail for this video, I did drop them all over the floor. And so they're not in the order I'd originally planned, but I have tried to separate them roughly into fiction versus non-fiction. Starting with fiction, How I Won a Nobel Prize by Julius Taranto. Going straight in there with a really thought-provoking book. This is about a much discussed topic, which is cancel culture. So this book imagines an island that hosts a university where all of the cancelled people are hosted. So they can come and live there separate from the rest of society who has thrown them out. And the book follows a graduate student who decides to follow her professor there after he's been disgraced by a scandal, and she has to decide between her own principles and following her career. So it's a very provocative topic and really invites you to think a lot about this issue. I love books like that that don't tell you clearly what you're supposed to think about any particular issue. They just really invite you to think about things in a whole new way. And I would say that the same goes for Everything's Fine by Cecilia Roberts. Again, such a thought-provoking conversation starting a novel. This is about a relationship between a progressive black woman and a conservative white man. It's told from the perspective of Jess, the woman in this relationship, and it's about her grappling with all of the ways in her life that she doesn't necessarily live in line with her values. So her relationship being a big part of that, but also her work, what she does in her job, all these ways that she finds that it can be hard sometimes to balance your life with what you believe in and what it takes for her to stick up for what really matters to her. Again, I loved this book. I loved going on that journey with Jess and having questions asked of you by the author that you don't always know how to answer. This book has a whole new look in paperback this summer. Doesn't this just look like the book of the summer? Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll is such a good book for true crime fans, or people who hate true crime, anyone who has engaged with true crime and grappled with how it fits with feminism. So Bright Young Women is a fictionalized version of a true story. It follows a story that you might be familiar with if you have read a lot of true crime before, and I won't say the name of the particular serial killer it's following because his name is not mentioned in the book either, and that is very, very deliberate. But he is a very famous, often glamorized and glorified American serial killer who has become famous for being portrayed in various true crime adaptations by very good-looking people. He was allegedly very good-looking. I've seen the pictures. He wasn't that good-looking. He was allegedly very intelligent. And Jessica Knoll really tears down all of those myths and makes the story bigger than being about this one man. So the problem with the glorification of particular serial killers is that people sort of love this narrative that they were this extraordinary person somehow and they get really obsessed with them. And what Jessica Knoll exposes in this book is that the problem is with a much wider systemic issue, that we have lived in a society that has allowed violence against women, that has allowed men like this particular serial killer or other serial killers throughout history to slip through the cracks and then glorified them rather than really, really telling the stories of their victims. And so Bright Young Women flips that around, and the title is borrowed from a phrase this particular serial killer was described by the judge in his trial as a bright young man, which is just extraordinary that that was said out loud. And so she flips it around to focus on the bright young women who were hurt by this man and this society. Now I Am Here by Chidi Ebere is a book about morality and about war, and it follows the final hours of a soldier who is close to death and dives into his identity as an ordinary person pulled into the terrible, terrible cruelty of war. What's really, really clever about this book is that you never know who this soldier is, which side of which war they are in. All you know is that this person went from being an ordinary, carefree young man to facing retribution as a war criminal. and taking any judgments, any preconceived notions that we might have if you gave this person a particular identity. If you take all of that away, you're able to just look at how war can allow these things to happen. The Amendments by Niamh Mulvey is a book that spans through generations of Irish women. So in the present day, we have Nell and her partner Adrienne, and they are planning to have a baby together. But that has brought up a lot of unresolved feelings for Nell, because she has a secret that she hasn't been able to face up to about the fact that she has been a mother before. And all of that is the reason why she finds herself unable to face her own mother. None of this is a spoiler, this is all contained in the book description. But we then kind of go back in time and we see the difference in the experience of being a woman living in Ireland through these different generations, and how the women's rights movement in Ireland has progressed and changed, and how it has impacted the people living there. So this book is thought-provoking on a bigger and smaller scale. On a bigger scale, it's thought-provoking about women's rights and about motherhood as an abstract concept, and how it has been thought about and how it has been defined and controlled and shaped through the years. And then on a smaller level, it's really thought-provoking about that mother-child relationship, which is a very, very specific and complicated and fascinating relationship. And talking of mothers and children, Concerning My Daughter by Kim Hae-jin is a very short novel which is so thought-provoking, and I absolutely love this one. So this is a Korean novel. It's about a mother whose 30-something-year-old daughter has to move back home with her for financial reasons and brings with her her girlfriend. And the mother begrudgingly allows them to move in, but has never been comfortable with the fact that her daughter is in a same-sex relationship. And what's really interesting about this book is it's told from the perspective of the mother, and so you're really put inside the mindset of somebody that you might not find it easy to empathize with at first. But by the end of this book, I found myself caring so much for the mother in this story and really feeling like I had gone on a journey with her, because you learn that all of her worries and cares about her daughter do come from a place of love. They do come from everything that she herself has been taught about the world and what is going to make the world hard for her daughter and what she wants, how much she wants the best for her daughter. But she also starts to grapple with her own hypocrisy. So she works at a care home for elderly people, and she finds herself getting angrier and angrier with the way that some of the people at this home are treated by the staff, people whose lives are considered less worthy by the staff there. And the anger that she feels at work starts to make her realize that perhaps she is doing the same thing, that she is judging some lives as being more worthy than others. And so it's a really, really moving, lovely, thought-provoking book about mothers and children, and about understanding other people's perspectives on the world, even people whose perspectives might seem to be the problem. They might seem to be the ones that are causing pain in the world, that actually every single person out there is capable of being empathized with and understood in some way if we try. And I love that. Right, for something a bit different, James by Percival Everett. This is a new release. This has been so talked about, this book, already. It is a reimagining of the story of Huckleberry Finn, but from the perspective of James. So Jim, in the original story, who is the enslaved character, who is off page for a lot of the story in the original, and Percival Everett has gone back and given him a voice and retold this seemingly charming childhood adventure from a totally new perspective. And it is such a thought-provoking book. It is such a page-turning book. This is what Percival Everett is amazing at, what he has always been amazing at. I actually have made a video where I go through a lot of his back catalogue, so I will link to that below if you want to get a bit of a flavour for the kinds of books that Percival Everett writes. But this is sort of a trademark, him absolutely the best of his game. He is so good at writing stories that are funny, that are very entertaining and witty, and almost sort of trap you in to realizing that you are facing down some very uncomfortable truths. But the whole way through, it's like Percival Everett is saying, you're allowed to laugh, it's okay. I'm making it that you're okay to laugh, but I am also shocking you and educating you as you go along. And so yeah, this book is such an experience, and you don't need to have read the original Huckleberry Finn. It's such a standalone adventure on its own. I have not read the original Huckleberry Finn, and I loved this book. I would love to know what the experience is like if you have read the original, so if that is you, please do comment below. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar has been a bit of a celebrity favourite. Sarah Jessica Parker is a big fan of this book. This is the story of a man grappling with the truth of his mother's death. So she had died many, many years earlier. She had been in a plane that was shot down out of the sky over the Persian Gulf when our main character Cyrus was just a baby, in a seemingly completely senseless death that he has always been grappling with ever since. And now, as a young man who is newly sober, he's recovering from alcoholism, he sets out to learn the truth about his mother's death and to try and give some meaning to a death that seems so completely meaningless. And so the book is really about this search for identity, about grappling with your identity and the different parts of your identity. It's also about art and how your identity can be reflected in your art. And it's also about generational trauma. I mean, there's a lot to think about in this book, and that's why it's had so much praise from so many people. I love this quote on the front from John Green, who says, "I kept forgetting to breathe." That's when you know a book is really thought-provoking. Then there's The Women by Kristen Hanna, which has been another book that's been so talked about and so beloved this year already. This is the book that since I started working here at Macmillan, I have never seen so many books out in the wild, random people reading this book on the tube, having it with them at restaurants, than The Women. I just keep seeing this one everywhere. Everyone in my family read this book before I even had a chance to recommend it to them. So this is about a young woman called Frankie who sets out to become a nurse during the Vietnam War. And it's really thought-provoking in a lot of ways, partly on what defines a hero. So she comes from a generation in which women are not considered to be heroes, and so the difference in her brother signing up to go and fight in Vietnam versus Frankie going to be a nurse and to save lives in Vietnam, the different reception to that news is really shocking. But it also taught me a lot about the perceptions of that war during that period, which I hadn't realised. So I knew that public perception of the war changed a lot, but I hadn't realised that the people coming back from Vietnam were treated so awfully. People who had gone over there, not necessarily with any choice to be sent to fight there, were treated as war criminals when they came back. And these are people who were very, very traumatised. And then Frankie, having been there as a nurse, isn't considered to have been there at all. So the fact that she also comes back with trauma, she comes back with PTSD from living through this horrifying experience, is completely dismissed by everybody. Her family want to pretend that she was never there. They just don't even want to acknowledge it. But when she does go to places that are set up to provide help and support for war veterans, she is not treated as one of them because she is a woman. So there's a lot that I didn't know about this period, and I found that really, really interesting to learn about and to think about. And then the last of my fiction recommendations before we move on to nonfiction is Wellness by Nathan Hill. This is still, I think, my favourite book that I've read this year so far. I absolutely loved it. It's a big chunky book, so settle down. It'll take you a little while to get through this one, and you will still wish that it went on for longer, or at least that's how I felt. On the surface, this is the story of a marriage. So we follow Jack and Elizabeth, who meet as college students in the 90s in Chicago, and then we jump forward to many years later when they are married with a kid, and their marriage is not looking as rosy as you might have hoped from the gorgeous romantic opening, and then we keep jumping back and forth in time and piecing together more of their story. But this book is about so much more than Jack and Elizabeth. Not to say that their story isn't a really huge part of it, because it is, and I loved them, and I loved getting to know them as people. But the way that Nathan Hill brings in so many thought-provoking topics for you to mull over while reading this book, he is extraordinary. Somehow while reading this book, I found myself thinking about the wellness industry, about placebos, about parenting, about manipulation, about social media, about how social media affects our politics, about how social media affects our politics, but we refuse to understand that it is doing that and can only see how it's affecting other people's politics. This book had me thinking about trauma. This book had me thinking about generations of repeated suffering. It had me thinking about gentrification. There is so much explored in this book, but in such a fun way. I found this book really page-turning. I was so enjoying every single second of reading Wellness, and then couldn't stop thinking about it ever since. Deep breath. So those were a bunch of fiction recommendations, but I do have a few more non-fiction, really thought-provoking books for you to read as well, starting with Sociopath by Patrick Gagne. This is a memoir written by a sociopath, all about her experience of living with sociopathy, and I cannot recommend it enough. I will link below to an interview I did where Patrick Gagne actually came into the office and chatted to me all about her life as a sociopath, and she was incredible and completely mesmerizing. I think the whole office fell in love with her that day, which is something she acknowledges. She says on the first page, "Your friends would probably describe me as nice, but guess what? I can't stand your friends." So that did leave me a little nervous. I have no idea what she actually thought of me when we did that interview, but I, for one, really liked her. So Sociopath tells the story of Patrick Gagne ever since she was a very young child, realizing that she was a bit different, that she struggled to process emotions in the same way as the people around her, all through her experience of finally finding a diagnosis for that and then learning to live with it. And there are so many misconceptions about sociopathy that this book helped correct for me. Namely, that one of the really interesting ways that Patrick Gagne describes sociopathy is as an emotional learning difficulty. So she said it is not that sociopaths cannot feel love, cannot feel any of these emotions, is that they might need a bit of help learning to do so. And so that is really interesting when you think about the fact that people often use words like sociopath to dismiss somebody as being a monster, as being someone not worthy of any kind of care and empathy. But actually, as Patrick Gagne is explaining, it is just a learning difficulty of sorts that can be treated and does deserve to be empathized with and cared about. I guarantee if you read this book, you will learn a lot that you did not know. You will challenge your assumptions of what a sociopath is. The Glass Cliff by Sophie Williams explores the idea that women in power are often brought in to impossible jobs. So the glass ceiling we've all heard of is this idea that there is a sort of invisible boundary that is stopping women progress higher up in their careers. And then the glass cliff is the idea that when a job is about to fall off a cliff, that is when a woman is brought in to do it and then set up to fail. So that's a really interesting idea, and think about it. If you think of some very, very high-profile examples of those roles, you will realize how true it is, and that there are quite a few prominent women that we think of automatically as having been pretty terrible at their jobs, and I am not here to stick up for any of those women in particular, but to suggest that it may be true, that they may have been given a rather impossible job. And so in this book, Sophie Williams explores this concept of the glass cliff and explains it a bit further, and also looks at ways that we can tackle it and help women rise up in the workplace and stop undermining them. The Price of Life by Jenny Kleeman is really interesting because it explores a topic that I had never even thought about before and hadn't realized how fascinating it is. So this is about the price of life. It is about what we are worth, what our lives are worth, and who gets to decide that. And there are so many different ways of looking at this. So anything from birth, the price of having a child, the price of having a child by surrogate, if you need IVF to have a child, there is a specific cost that is attached to bringing a child into this world, and that cost is different for different people. All the way through to the end of your life, the cost of hiring a hitman to kill somebody, the cost of saving somebody's life. Why are some people's lives considered more worth saving than others? The price of life-saving drugs versus the cost of a ransom that somebody's life might be held for. It's such a thought-provoking topic that I'd never really considered, but that there is really somebody there crunching the numbers and making decisions on who gets life-saving treatment and who doesn't. And what does it say for our humanity when all of that is just reduced to the maths? Will You Care If I Die is written by Nicholas Lunaber, who is a social organiser in Sweden, where there is a lot of violence amongst young people, particularly a lot of gun violence. Gun violence in Malmo is the worst anywhere in Europe. And this book is written as a letter from Nicholas Lunaber to a boy called Elijah, who was a teenage boy that he met through his work and allowed into his home, which was kind of crossing a boundary for him, and did everything in his power to protect this young boy. And the fact that it's written as this letter to Elijah makes it a really touching memoir about what it means to really care for somebody in this world that has become in so many ways so uncaring. It looks at class and race and the increasing polarization of this world and what an unexpected love can look like in the midst of all of that. Codependent addresses the big thought-provoking topic that is on everyone's mind all the time at the moment, AI. So Codependent is written by Madhumita Murja, and it is all about the very, very real threat of AI and the possibilities created by it. So she really dives into the systems of how AI is created. So a lot of us who, I'll speak for myself, I don't know, you may know more about this than I do, but I just think of AI as this incredibly technological, high-tech, futuristic concept. But actually, Madhumita Murja exposes the sometimes comically basic ways that AI is built. So the real people creating large and often flawed data sets to build AI from, and then how that plays out, the flaws that are carried forward to stop AI from being as all-intelligent as it claims to be. There are very real and very dangerous problems with this. There is a worry that AI will perpetuate biases that are programmed into it by humans. So there's this example that she goes into of how in the Netherlands there was an app created to predict which children were more likely to become future criminals, which is such an awful concept anyway, but was built on this very, very flawed and often racist data. It's a pretty dystopian world that we are already living in because of AI, and so it is time for us to all start thinking about it very hard. But then, going way back into history, before AI was ever even conceived of, Heresy by Catherine Nixie is a really fascinating look at religious history. Because did you know that the stories that have been passed down to form Christianity today, the Gospels that are now seen as the foundation of Christianity, and in fact have shaped a lot of other Western culture, art, literature, they were not the only versions of the story originally. There were a lot of different stories. There were, in fact, a lot of different Jesuses. There are different versions of Jesus. There was a Jesus who was a lot more aggressive than the one that is talked about today. There were also other saviors talked about who also performed different miracles. And so it is perhaps just by chance that the particular stories that are still believed in today happened to be the ones that were passed down. There are stories and ideas that would be considered heresy today that were once a believed in part of Christianity. It's pretty interesting, makes you think. And finally, my last thought-provoking book recommendation is The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, which will redefine the way that you think about money. And this is a book that anyone can read. You do not have to be good at maths. You do not have to be good at finance. This is a book about challenging the way that you think and the way that you behave. So it's not necessarily about what you know that makes you good with money. Anyone can learn certain facts. It doesn't necessarily make you good with money. It is in fact about the way that you act. So in the book, Morgan Housel goes through 19 different short stories all about the really strange ways that people think about money and the strange decisions that people make about money. And then through that lens, encourages you to think differently and reevaluate wealth and greed and what it all means and how you can actually make better decisions about money. So hopefully I've given you a lot to think about there and a lot to read. Do let me know in the comments below if any of those particularly jumped out at you, and I will link here to that interview that I mentioned with Patrick Gagney, so do click through if you would like to watch that and learn a bit more about sociopathy. I really recommend. She was a fascinating person to listen to, and I'll see you next time.